Welcome to SLUMBERVERSE! Oh gee, another dimension of naps.
Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. The midwife said later that in 40 years of bringing children into the world, she had never seen a newborn open her eyes with such ancient recognition, as if Iris had been listening to conversations from the other side and finally understood she was meant to join them. The blood moon's gentle crimson light painted the delivery room walls in soft shadows, and even as the medical staff cleaned and weighed her, Iris's gaze kept drifting toward the window, where that patient red orb hung like a lantern someone had lit just for her arrival. Her grandmother, Nana Rose, who had been pacing the hospital corridors with the restless energy of someone expecting important changes, stopped mid-step when she heard not the sharp wail of most newborns, but something that sounded almost like recognition, a soft exhale of greeting between old friends. Nana Rose had witnessed 2 blood moons before this night, and both had marked moments when the old gift stirred in their family line like a sleeping river, remembering its course toward the sea. She recognized the signs immediately. How Iris studied reflective surfaces with unusual focus, her tiny fingers opening and closing as if reaching for something just beyond the visible world. In the chrome bed rails, in the dark window glass, in the still water of the plastic pitcher beside the hospital bed, faint threads of red light seemed to emanate from their reflections, like gentle heat waves, and the baby's moss-colored eyes would track these crimson streams with the concentrated attention of someone learning to read words in an almost remembered language. The nurses commented on how peaceful Iris remained, sleeping most soundly during the night shift when the hospital grew quiet and people's emotional defenses softened in the darkness. Rose understood why. She could feel it herself, the way sorrow and worry moved differently in the small hours, becoming more visible, more honest, less protected by the bright armor of daytime pretending. The baby was already learning to read the emotional weather of the world around her, beginning to understand that pain had its own geography, flowing through human hearts like underground rivers that most people spent their lives trying not to notice when they brought Iris home to the cottage where salt air mixed with the fragrance of Nana Rose's herb garden. The real education began in whispers and gentle observations. Rose would hold her granddaughter near mirrors and still water, watching as those faint crimson threads became clearer around certain visitors. The postman, whose shoulders carried the weight of delivering bad news. Mrs. Chen from the bakery, whose eyes held the shadow of recent loss. The lighthouse keeper, whose solitary vigil had gathered decades of unspoken loneliness around his weathered hands like invisible gloves. Their feelings. "Little one," Nana Rose would murmur in her voice soft as worn velvet, as Iris pointed a small finger toward the shimmering red currents that flowed around people like slow, patient streams seeking the sea. Feelings that need somewhere to go, like rivers that have forgotten their way home. She never used heavy words like pain or sorrow directly, understanding that for a child, such labels could become burdens themselves. Instead, she spoke of currents and tides, of colors that lived in the heart's hidden chambers, teaching Iris that these crimson flows were not to be feared, but approached with the same gentle reverence one might offer a wounded bird. In the sanctuary of their cottage, surrounded by the soft tick-tock of the grandfather clock and the endless conversation between wind and window, Iris learned to distinguish between the quick, bright red of fleeting frustration and the deep, slow crimson of grief that had settled into someone's bones like winter cold. She discovered that the streams moved differently around different people, sometimes swirling faster when someone tried to hide their pain, sometimes lying still and heavy like sediment at the bottom of a quiet pond, waiting for the right moment to be stirred into motion again. Nana Rose called it the gentle art of seeing what the heart holds, though for Iris it was simply learning to breathe with the world's true colors, understanding that even the deepest sorrows held their own profound beauty, like rich, dark earth after a long rain. There was no urgency in these early lessons, no need to rush toward healing or fixing. The crimson streams had waited long in their hidden channels, and they could wait a little longer for small, understanding hands to learn the patient art of invitation, the tender skill of making space for what needed to flow toward the light. As walking found her legs and words found her tongue, The red currants began calling to Iris with voices soft as evening rain on garden leaves. She was 3 when it first happened, sitting cross-legged in Nana Rose's herb garden, while Mrs. Chen from the bakery wept quietly over the fence, her shoulders carrying the thick, honey-slow crimson of grief that had crystallized around her heart since her husband's passing. Without thinking, Iris reached toward that sorrowful stream as naturally as she might touch a flower, her small fingers extending toward the shimmering current that flowed like visible sadness through the twilight air. The moment her fingertips brushed the edge of Mrs. Chen's pane, both women gasped in surprise. Mrs. Chen pressed her hand to her chest, feeling a weight she had carried for months suddenly lighten, while Nana Rose recognized the moment when gift transforms into responsibility, when seeing becomes the possibility of healing. "Iris, sweetheart," Nana Rose said gently, lifting the child onto her lap, while Mrs. Chen looked at her own hands with wonder. "We need to talk about the difference between your feelings and everyone else's." She carried Iris to the old wooden bench beneath the night-blooming jasmine, where the air held that particular stillness that comes just before important lessons. "When you touched the red stream, what happened inside your own heart? Did it feel heavy or light? Did it feel like you or like someone else?" These were complex questions for a small child, but Iris considered them seriously, her moss-colored eyes reflecting the first stars as she tried to separate the threads of experience that had tangled together in that moment of connection. The answer came slowly, over weeks of patient practice in the sanctuary of their garden. Iris learned that her own feelings moved like quicksilver through her chest, bright and changeable as weather, while other people's emotions felt different against her skin, thicker, older, carrying the weight of stories she didn't know. When she touched Mrs. Chen's grief, it felt like wearing a coat that belonged to someone much larger, heavy with experiences that weren't her own. But when she felt her own sadness about a broken toy or a scraped knee, it moved through her like warm water, familiar and manageable and completely hers. Nana Rose taught her to imagine a gentle boundary around her own heart, like a garden fence made of soft light that could let love pass through while keeping other people's pain from taking root in her own emotional soil. "Your heart is your home, little one," she would say during their evening lessons, when the jasmine released its sweetest fragrance and the world grew soft with approaching sleep. "You can invite visitors, but you don't have to let them move in permanently." They practiced with small things first, the postman's worry about his aging mother, the grocery clerk's frustration with difficult customers, the stray cat's loneliness as it wandered between houses looking for belonging. Each practice session became a meditation in discernment, teaching Iris to feel the difference between compassion and absorption, between helping and taking on burdens that weren't meant for her young shoulders. She learned to approach the crimson streams like a careful gardener, offering her presence without losing herself in the process. The garden became her classroom, the night-blooming flowers her silent teachers. She would watch the moonflowers unfurl their pale, luminous petals, as if releasing their own soft secrets to the darkness, and she practiced extending her awareness not to absorb, but simply to perceive. She learned that the red rivers, when approached with true gentleness, would often soften at the edges, becoming less agitated, more willing to flow toward offered kindness, rather than clinging desperately to their hosts. Nana Rose introduced grounding techniques that became as natural as breathing. "Feel the earth beneath your feet, the breath in your lungs, the beating of your own heart," she would whisper, when Iris felt overwhelmed by the emotional currents swirling around them. "These are yours always." They would practice together in the early morning mist, bare feet pressed into cool soil, hands over hearts, learning to find the steady rhythm that belonged only to Iris, the quiet song that could anchor her when other people's storms grew too loud. The breakthrough came on a warm summer evening when old Mr. Santos from down the street stopped by with vegetables from his garden and shoulders heavy with the dark crimson of missing his late wife. Iris watched the thick streams swirling around him like slow smoke, and instead of reaching out immediately, she took a deep breath and felt for her own boundaries first. She imagined her heart surrounded by that fence of gentle light, then opened her hands and simply waited, letting Mr. Santos know through her presence that his sorrow was welcome to flow if it chose to, but that she wasn't trying to pull it from him or make his grief disappear. What happened next felt like watching a river remember its natural course. The crimson streams began moving toward her open palms, not because she was drawing them, but because she had created a safe space where they could flow freely. As the dark currents touched her hands, they seemed to lighten and dissolve, like ink mixing with clear water, until it becomes transparent again. Mr. Santos straightened slightly. His breathing deepened, and for the first time in months, he smiled when he looked at his tomatoes instead of seeing only reminders of the garden he used to share with his beloved Maria. That night, as Nana Rose tucked Iris into bed, she whispered the most important lesson of all. The red streams don't belong to you, sweetheart, but your kindness in helping them find their way home, that belongs to you completely. Iris fell asleep understanding that her gift wasn't about taking away pain, but about offering it a place to rest and transform, like a way station where sorrow could pause in its long journey toward whatever healing looked like for each person who carried it. In her dreams, she walked through gardens where red rivers flowed gently toward the sea, and every step felt like coming home to herself. In the days that followed Mr. Santos's visit, Iris carried herself with a new kind of quiet confidence, as if the successful clearing had taught her feet how to find steadier ground. She moved through Nana Rose's cottage, with the careful attention of someone who had discovered that her hands could hold more than toys and flowers. They could hold space for other people's sorrow to rest and transform. The red currents around their neighbors no longer felt like mysterious weather she could only observe. They had become invitations written in a language she was finally learning to read with both her eyes and her heart. Say, opportunity to practice this newfound understanding. Arrived on a Tuesday morning, when the scent of rising dough and warm sesame oil drifted down their street like a gentle summons, Mrs. Chen had reopened her bakery after weeks of closed shutters and silence, though the crimson streams around her shoulders still moved with the thick, honey-slow rhythm of grief that had settled deep into her bones. Iris could see them swirling through the bakery's front window as she and Nana Rose approached, not the sharp, bright red of fresh pain, but the darker currents that come when sorrow has had time to crystallize into something more permanent and stubborn. "Would you like to visit Mrs. Chen?" Nana Rose asked softly, though she already knew the answer from the way Iris's steps had slowed near the bakery door, her moss-colored eyes tracking the heavy streams that clung to the older woman like invisible shawls. This time, instead of stumbling into healing by accident, Iris felt the clear intention forming in her chest, a conscious choice to offer her presence as a harbor where Mrs. Chen's grief might choose to rest. The bell above the door chimed their arrival into air, thick with flour dust and the yeasty warmth of proofing bread. Mrs. Chen looked up from her work, hands paused in their kneading, and Iris saw immediately how the red currents had grown thicker since their last encounter, more resistant to natural flow. They moved around Mrs. Chen's heart like slow, dark honey, carrying not just the weight of missing her husband, but the secondary grief of a world that expected her to heal faster than her heart knew how to manage. "Hello, little one," Mrs. Chen said, her voice carrying the hollow echo of someone who had been talking to emptiness for too long. "Come to watch the bread rise?" But Iris heard the deeper question beneath the words, the quiet hope that maybe, somehow, something else might rise too, some lightness in the heavy air around her chest, some space for breath in the tight quarters where her sorrow had taken up residence. Iris approached the counter slowly, her small hands warm from the cup of chamomile tea Nana Rose had prepared as an offering. Instead of reaching toward the crimson streams immediately, she set the tea down gently and looked up at Mrs. Chen with eyes that held all the patient wisdom her grandmother had taught her. "Mrs. Chen," she said in her clear, serious voice, "would it be okay if I tried to help the red streams find somewhere to go? They look very tired from holding on so tight." The question itself seemed to shift something in the bakery's atmosphere. Mrs. Chen's hands stilled completely in their work, and for a moment, the only sounds were the gentle hum of the ovens and Nana Rose's spoon stirring honey into her own tea at a corner table. Then Mrs. Chen nodded slowly, as if agreeing with something inside herself as much as with the child before her. "Yes," she whispered, "I think they are very tired indeed." What followed was Iris's first truly intentional purging, and it unfolded with the careful grace of a dance between invitation and release. She settled herself on a small stool beside the counter, closed her eyes, and felt for that fence of gentle light around her own heart, making sure it was strong and clear before opening her palms toward Mrs. Chen's suffering. She began by simply breathing with the older woman, matching her rhythm until their exhales synchronized like two instruments finding harmony in the warm, flower-scented air. Then, keeping her hands open and relaxed, Iris extended her awareness toward the thick crimson currents, not trying to grab or pull them, but offering her presence like a safe harbor where they might choose to flow. The streams responded slowly at first, as if they had forgotten that movement was possible after months of circling the same tired patterns. As the dark currents began moving toward her open palms, they seemed to lighten and thin, transforming from the deep red of crystallized grief into something more translucent, more willing to dissolve like sugar stirring into warm tea. Mrs. Chen's breathing gradually deepened, her shoulders releasing tension she hadn't realized she was carrying. When the last of the heavy streams had dissolved into the morning light, she looked at her own hands with wonder, flexing her fingers as if testing whether they still remembered how to reach for things other than memories. "I can smell the bread again," she whispered. And Iris understood that this was profound. Grief often steals the ability to notice beauty that isn't connected to what we've lost. As they sat together in the bakery's golden warmth, Iris felt the quiet satisfaction of work well done, but also something else tugging at the edge of her awareness. Through the front window, she could see the lighthouse in the distance, its white tower stark against the morning sky. Even in daylight, she sensed something there, an ancient, patient sorrow that didn't swirl or reach like other streams, but simply abided with the steady persistence of stone worn smooth by countless tides. It would wait, she knew, until she was ready to learn from sorrows that had made peace with permanence. The morning after Mrs. Chen's clearing, Iris found herself drawn to the kitchen window again and again, her gaze pulled toward the distant lighthouse like metal to magnet. The white tower stood patient against the grey sky, and each time she looked, the ancient sorrow she had glimpsed seemed to pulse with its own quiet rhythm, steady as a heartbeat, deep as ocean currents that have been flowing the same path for centuries. This wasn't the restless grief she had learned to clear, but something that had made peace with permanence, something that had learned to serve rather than simply endure. "The lighthouse is calling to you," Nana Rose observed quietly, finding Iris at the window for the third time before noon, her small hands pressed against the cool glass. "Samuel has been the keeper there for more years than you've been breathing, and his sorrow has grown roots deeper than the foundation stones. Perhaps it's time you learned that not all red streams are asking to flow away." They walked the coastal path in comfortable silence, their feet finding the worn track that wound through saltgrass and wild roses toward the lighthouse. The air carried the eternal conversation between wind and wave, and with each step closer to the tower, Iris felt the quality of the crimson currents changing. These streams moved like deep ocean tides, slow and vast and nearly black with age, not swirling with urgency, but flowing with the patient persistence of water that has carved canyons over millennia. Samuel opened the lighthouse door before they could knock, as if he had been watching their approach through the salt-stained windows. He was tall and weathered, his hands marked by decades of tending machinery and rope, his eyes holding the particular clarity that comes from spending years watching horizons for ships that might never appear. The red streams around him were unlike anything Iris had encountered. They didn't cling or reach or demand attention, but simply existed as part of him, like the grey in his beard or the lines around his eyes. "Rose," he said with a voice smooth as driftwood, "and this must be the child who helps hearts remember how to breathe lighter. I've been wondering when the lighthouse would draw you up. Here." He gestured them inside with hands that moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned that every action in a lighthouse must be deliberate and sure. "The light's been different since you started your work in town, steadier somehow, as if it knows there's finally someone who understands what it means to guide things safely home." Inside the lighthouse, spiral stairs wound upward past windows that framed the harbor in perfect circles of silver light. With each step higher, Iris felt the weight of Samuel's ancient sorrow more clearly, but also something else, a profound acceptance that had transformed the heaviness into something almost beautiful, like how the ocean's depth makes its surface more magnificent rather than more frightening. At the top, Surrounded by the great lens that gathered daylight and transformed it into the night's guiding beacon, Samuel began to speak about the difference between grief that seeks healing and grief that seeks honoring. Some rivers, he said, his hands moving with practiced reverence over the lighthouse mechanisms, aren't meant to be drained. They're meant to flow deeper, becoming springs that feed other kinds of growth. He spoke of his wife, whose name he carried like a prayer, and how her passing had initially felt like a storm, trying to tear the lighthouse from its foundation. But with time, he continued, adjusting the lens with movements that held 30 years of devotion, the sorrow settled into something else. It became the weight that keeps me steady when the winds are fierce, the reminder that makes my hands gentle when I tend the light. Iris watched the dark currents around Samuel, understanding dawning in her chest like sunrise. This grief had aged into something sacred, like wine that becomes more valuable with time, and she found herself learning a new kind of respect for pain that had chosen to stay and serve rather than seeking release. When she lifted her small hands in the familiar gesture of invitation, the crimson streams flickered politely at the edges, acknowledging her kindness, then settled back with the steady patience of waves returning to their natural rhythm along the shore. "You did not do it wrong," Samuel said gently, noticing her confusion. "You did it exactly right. You asked, and the sorrow answered in its way. It told you it has work to do here." He showed her how the great lens focused light into its nightly sweep across the dark water, explaining how his grief had become part of how he loved, not just his wife's memory, but every ship struggling toward shore, every soul seeking safe harbor in the darkness. As afternoon light began to deepen toward evening, Iris practiced simply being with Samuel's ancient streams without trying to change them, learning to offer her presence as witness rather than healer. She discovered that some of her most important work would be recognizing when not to intervene, when to honor the sacred weight that some hearts choose to carry as their contribution to the world's healing. "Every night," Samuel said as they prepared the beacon for its vigil, "this light reaches toward ships that might be lost, offering them a reference point for finding their way home. Your gift works the same way, child, sometimes by clearing the storms, sometimes by simply being a steady point of light that reminds people they're not alone in the darkness." That evening, walking home with Nana Rose through streets, touched by the lighthouse's faithful glow, Iris carried new questions about the relationship between sorrow and service, between healing and honoring. The red streams in town looked different now. Some still called for clearing, but others seemed to pulse with their own quiet purpose, and she was beginning to understand that wisdom meant learning to tell the difference between rivers that needed to flow away and rivers that needed to flow deeper, becoming the underground springs that feed the world's capacity for compassion. The morning after Samuel's teaching, Iris found herself studying the rhythm of waves against the harbor rocks with new eyes, watching how the water knew exactly when to advance and when to retreat, never forcing its way but always finding the path of least resistance toward its destination. She began to understand that the red streams in people moved with similar tides, gathering strength during certain moments and requiring rest during others, following patterns larger and older than any individual sorrow. Nana Rose noticed this shift in her granddaughter's attention, the way Iris would pause at windows to observe not just the crimson currents around their neighbors, but the subtle changes in how those streams moved throughout the day. "The sea teaches us about timing," her grandmother said softly, joining Iris at the kitchen window where they could see the harbor's eternal conversation with the shore. "And your gift follows those same ancient rhythms. There are moments for action and moments for patience, and learning the difference is what transforms ability into wisdom." She began teaching Iris to read the lunar calendar the way Samuel read his tide tables, showing her how the red streams grew more visible and responsive as the moon swelled toward fullness, how they turned inward and quiet during the dark moon nights, and how they seemed to pulse with their own deep music during the rare blood moons when the sky wore crimson, like a gentle benediction. "Our family has always been connected to these cycles," Nana Rose explained, her fingers tracing the moon phases in an old almanac whose pages held the accumulated wisdom of generations. "Your gift isn't separate from the natural world. It's woven into its deepest patterns." Iris began keeping a small journal, sketching the quality of light she perceived around people, and noting how it changed with the weather. The seasons, and especially the moon's patient progression, through its eternal dance. She discovered that during the new moon, her work felt gentle and almost effortless, like helping water find its natural course downhill. As the moon waxed, the crimson currents grew brighter and more willing to respond to invitation, building toward the full moon nights, when her perception became so acute she could sense the faintest whispers of old heartbreak in the way people walked or held their shoulders. The lesson about timing came through experience, as the most important lessons always do. A fisherman named Henrik, whose red streams had grown thick and stubborn with years of worry about debts and storms, asked for her help on an afternoon when the moon was dark and the tide was pulling strongly away from shore. Eager to help and confident from her recent successes, Iris invited his sorrow to flow without first feeling for the natural rhythm of the moment. The crimson currents began to move, then suddenly recoiled like a rope pulled too tight, snapping back into Henrik's chest with a force that left them both breathless and shaken. Nana Rose, who had been watching from the pier with the patient attention of someone who understood that mistakes were often the most generous teachers, approached with a thermos of chamomile tea and the kind of gentle presence that could transform embarrassment into learning. "The tide was wrong," she said simply, pouring tea that steamed like small prayers in the salt air. "Not your intention, not your skill, just the timing. Some moments ask for action, and some ask for waiting." They tried again the following week when the moon was waxing and the evening tide was flowing toward shore. This time, Iris felt first for the natural rhythm of Henrik's sorrow, matching her breathing to its pace, waiting for the moment when the crimson streams seemed ready to move rather than trying to convince them. The clearing unfolded slowly, gently, like watching ice melt in spring sunshine, and when Henrik stood to leave, his shoulders carried the easy weight of someone who had been heard rather than hurried. From this experience, Iris began developing what would become her lifelong practice of preparation. Before each session, she would light a single candle and place a small bowl of sea salt on the table, symbols that reminded her to honor both the light she offered and the ancient wisdom of the tides. She learned to wash her hands with intention, touching her fingertips to her heart, to remember where her own boundaries lived, and to ask the moon's permission before beginning work that required its particular kind of strength. As her understanding deepened, Iris found she could sense not just individual streams, but the way they connected throughout their small town, flowing like underground rivers that linked one heart to another in patterns of shared experience. During market days, she felt how excitement and anxiety wove together in bright, quick currents. On Sunday mornings, she sensed the collective longing that rose like morning mist from the congregation, condensing into something that felt like hope when the old hymns became more listening than singing. But it was during her first blood moon after Samuel's teaching that Iris truly understood the scope of her gift. As the moon climbed the sky wearing its dress of deep crimson, she felt her perception expand until she could sense the entire town's emotional weather as one vast, breathing organism. The red streams didn't just flow through individuals. They connected everyone in an intricate web of shared sorrow and mutual healing, and she began to glimpse her role not as someone who cleared pain from people, but as someone who helped the community's emotional rivers flow more freely toward whatever healing looked like for each unique heart. Standing in her grandmother's garden, under that patient crimson moon, Iris felt herself settling into a deeper understanding of her place in the world's ancient systems of care, knowing that her work was just beginning to reveal its true shape and purpose. The blood moon's gentle teaching settled into Iris's awareness like sediment finding the bottom of a still pond, and in the nights that followed, she found herself drawn to the weekly market that bloomed along the waterfront every Thursday, as twilight painted the harbor in shades of amber and rose. The expanded perception she had gained under that crimson sky made the world feel both larger and more intimate, as if she could sense the invisible threads that connected every heart in their small coastal town, threads that seemed to pulse most clearly in the lantern-lit spaces where people gathered to share stories, along with their handmade goods. Nana Rose encouraged these explorations, understanding that Iris's gift needed to learn about the red streams, not just in moments of crisis, but in the ordinary magic of neighbors choosing vegetables and trading recipes under strings of warm light. "The market teaches different lessons than our quiet garden," she said, helping Iris select a small wicker basket for carrying the lavender sachets they would offer in exchange for honey and fresh bread. There you'll see how the crimson currents move when people feel safe to lower their guards, when the gentle darkness gives them permission to be more honest about the weather in their hearts. The night market lived in the space between the old brick warehouses and the sea, transforming the practical pier into something that felt like a celebration whispered between friends. Lanterns swung gently from ropes strung between wooden posts, casting pools of golden light that made every face look softer, every conversation sound like music drifting on salt air. Steam rose from soup pots and tea kettles, carrying the mingled scents of cardamom and rising dough, of night-blooming jasmine, and the eternal conversation between wind and wave. Iris felt the red streams differently here. Woven together like threads in a tapestry, she was only beginning to learn to read. The currents moved with the relaxed honesty that comes when people step away from daylight's expectations, flowing in gentle eddies around clusters of friends sharing stories, in quick bright spirals around children weaving between stalls, in deeper, slower rivers around those who came seeking not just goods, but the particular comfort of being quietly seen by their neighbors. She noticed Marcus first, at his family's bakery stall where the air shimmered with heat from portable ovens and the yeasty sweetness of dough that had been tended with patient hands since before dawn. He was perhaps a few years older than Iris, with flour dusting his dark hair and eyes that held the particular weight of someone trying to honor a legacy while longing for permission to dream his own dreams. The red streams around him moved with complex rhythms, swift currents of creative energy braided together with the deeper, more persistent flow of expectations that had been kneaded into every recipe he inherited from his father's careful hands. When Marcus offered samples to passers-by, Iris could see how the crimson currents grew thicker, when customers praised bread that tasted exactly like his father's famous loaves, how they lightened slightly when children laughed at his gentle jokes while their parents selected rolls for Sunday dinner. His hands moved through familiar motions with practiced skill, but his eyes often drifted toward the experimental pastries he kept on a smaller tray, delicate things flavored with lavender and sea salt, creations that carried his own quiet hopes like secrets, folded into layers of buttery dough. Near Marcus's warmth and bustle, Eleanor worked at a table covered with fabrics that seemed to hold moonlight in their weaving, her needle moving through cloth with the precise grace of someone who had learned to stitch feelings into patterns too beautiful for words. The crimson streams around her flowed differently than Marcus's weighted expectations. These currents were soft and translucent, like rose petals drifting on calm water, carrying the particular ache of love that had never found its voice, affection that had been transformed into countless small acts of creation. Because it had nowhere else to land, Iris discovered, through patient observation, that Elena had been quietly caring for the lighthouse keeper's nephew for years, pouring her unspoken feelings into embroidered handkerchiefs and carefully tailored shirts that she would leave anonymously at his door, signed only with a small violet stitched into the corner. Each piece carried threads of longing so fine they were almost invisible, but Iris could see them glowing like silk in candlelight, beautiful and heartbreaking in their patient hope for recognition that might never come. As weeks passed and Iris returned to the market with growing understanding, she began to see that her role here wasn't to clear everyone's crimson streams, but to help people recognize the beauty in their own emotional weather. She learned to offer the gift of witnessing, buying a small pastry from Marcus with genuine appreciation for his experimental flavors, lingering at Elena's stall to admire the intricate patterns that held such careful love, creating small moments where people felt truly seen in the fullness of their complicated hearts. The night market became her classroom in the complexity of human connection, teaching her that healing sometimes meant not removing pain, but helping people understand the stories their sorrow was trying to tell them. In the gentle darkness between lanterns, she glimpsed how individual red streams connected to form the larger tapestry of community care, how Marcus's inherited burden and Elena's patient love were both part of the intricate web of shared experience that made their small town a place where hearts could rest and be tended by invisible hands. Walking home with Nana Rose through streets touched by lantern light and the salt-sweet air of evening tides, Iris carried new questions about the relationship between healing and connection, Between individual pain and the collective heart that held them all in its patient, luminous embrace. The questions that bloomed from her nights at the market followed Iris home like gentle shadows, settling into her dreams and waking thoughts with the persistent curiosity of seeds that had found fertile ground. She began to understand that witnessing was only the first movement in a longer symphony of healing, and that the red streams she observed weren't asking for quick relief but for something more intentional. Sacred space where private pain could transform into shared wisdom, where the careful architecture of healing could honor the complexity of what people carried in their hearts. Samuel, who had become her teacher in the deeper mysteries of sorrow that serves, noticed this shift during their weekly visits to the lighthouse. "You're ready to learn the construction of containers," he said one afternoon as they polished the great lens together, their hands moving in synchronized circles that caught and scattered light like promises. Not just the gentle touch that invites release, but the careful preparation of sanctuary strong enough to hold what emerges when people truly let themselves be seen. He taught her first about the architecture of healing space, showing her how he readied the lighthouse each evening, not just with mechanical precision, but with reverent attention to creating sacred boundary. Every night, he explained, adjusting the lens with movements that had become prayer through repetition, "I prepare this beacon not just to cast light, but to receive whatever darkness might be seeking guidance home. Your work requires the same kind of intentional sanctuary, places where people can safely lower the defenses they need to survive daylight's expectations." Under his guidance, Iris began transforming the small sunroom at the back of Nana Rose's cottage, where light softened through sheer curtains, and the sea's eternal conversation could be heard like steady breathing. They placed a low table near the window with a single beeswax candle, a shallow bowl for water sprinkled with sea salt, and a smooth river stone that fit perfectly in her palm. Beside these, a wicker basket held soft cloths and a small bell whose tone fell through the air like a drop into still water. The space began to feel different, not sacred in a grand way, but respectful, like the corner of a kitchen where bread is allowed to rise undisturbed. The emotional preparation proved even more essential than the physical arrangements. Samuel taught her to ground herself, not just in her own boundaries, but in her connection to the larger patterns that held them all. The turning of tides, the breathing of the earth, the patient circulation of sorrow and joy through the community's shared heart. "Before you invite someone else's pain to flow," he said, his weathered hands demonstrating the careful attention required to tend flame without being consumed, "you must feel your own roots reaching deep enough to remain steady when the winds of their release grow strong." Iris learned to begin each session by touching her own heart and feeling for the quiet song that belonged only to her, the rhythm that would anchor her when other people's storms grew loud. She would wash her hands with intention, touching her fingertips to her heart to remember where her boundaries lived, then ring the bell once to signal the room's listening. Most importantly, she learned the art of conscious transformation. When crimson streams flowed toward her open hands, she could guide their dissolution in ways that honored what they had been, while allowing them to become something new. The technical aspects evolved through patient experimentation. She discovered that different types of red streams required different approaches. Fresh grief responded to gentle invitation and patient presence, while ancient sorrow needed to be approached like a wild creature that had learned to fear human touch. Inherited pain, the crimson currents passed down through family lines like unwanted heirlooms, required special care because they carried not just individual wounds, but generational patterns woven into the fabric of identity itself. Her first formal session took place on a quiet evening, when Marcus arrived with flour on his sleeves and uncertainty in his eyes. He stood with his hands on the back of the chair for a moment before sitting, looking at the bowl of water as if it might show him something he had misplaced. Iris offered him warm tea and asked gently, "Is there a part of the heaviness that wants to stay?" Marcus's shoulders lifted with his breath, then lowered. "Yes," he said after a long pause. "The part that keeps my father close, the part that makes me careful." They sat with the rooms listening until Iris sensed that subtle shift, like a tide turning beneath the surface. When she opened her hands, palms up, not pulling or pressing but simply offering a place for the overworked strands to rest, the crimson threads that rose from Marcus were thin and taut. woven with exhaustion and old fears of disappointing someone whose voice still lived in the kitchen long after his chair was empty. As the threads touched her palms, she guided their transformation, watching them lighten from deep red to rose to pale gold, finally dissolving like starshine, returning to the vast darkness that held them all. Marcus's breath deepened, his shoulders releasing tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. "I think I can try the lavender rolls again," he said, a small surprised smile finding its way to his face. "Not to run away from my father's bread, but to see what my own hands want to say." After he left, Iris rang the bell once more and poured the water from the bowl into the soil beneath Nana Rose's jasmine, whispering thanks and returning what the earth had taught her to transform. As her practice deepened, Iris understood that her gift was not about erasing the red streams from the world, for they were an intrinsic part of human experience. Instead, it was about creating moments of grace within that experience, allowing sorrow to flow and transform, making space for breath and beauty through careful invitation, patient presence, and the gentle alchemy that turned pain into wisdom, fear into compassion, and isolation into the recognition that no heart suffers alone in the vast, interconnected web of care that held their small town like a lighthouse, hold ships safe in its steady beam. The lavender rolls had become Marcus's quiet revolution, their delicate floral scent weaving through the night market, like a gentle announcement that change could happen without abandoning what came before. Iris found herself drawn to his stall not just by the warm, yeasty air that carried hints of sea salt and innovation, but by the way the crimson streams around him had begun to dance rather than merely flow, quick, bright threads of creative joy now moving freely alongside the deeper, steadier currents of his family's legacy. Like two melodies finding harmony in the same song, their conversations had grown longer in the quiet spaces between customers, when the market's bustle softened to murmurs, and the lanterns cast pools of golden light that made every exchange feel more intimate. Marcus would tell her stories, while his hands moved through familiar motions, how his grandfather could feel the soul of wheat through his fingertips, how his father had spent decades trying to match that silent perfection, kneading his own unfulfilled dreams into every loaf until the bread itself became heavy with expectation. Iris listened with more than her ears, sensing the crimson threads of inherited pressure that had been passed down like family recipes, beautiful in their devotion, but sometimes too rich to digest comfortably. "Sometimes I feel like I'm baking my father's dreams instead of my own," Marcus confessed one evening, as they shared the last lavender roll while the lighthouse swept its patient beam across darkening water. "And I love his dreams, truly, but mine taste different, like a flavor he might not have understood." The red streams around him moved with gentle melancholy, rich with affection, but touched by the particular ache of a path chosen by others' hands rather than his own heart. Iris recognized this as the deeper work, the kind that revealed itself most clearly under the patient gaze of a blood moon. She had been feeling the approach of the next crimson tide in her bones, the way Samuel had taught her to read the subtle shifts that preceded moments of profound possibility. When she mentioned this to Marcus, his eyes held the quiet readiness of someone who had been preparing for a conversation he didn't yet know how to begin. The blood moon rose like a gentle benediction over their small town, casting everything in soft, otherworldly light that made the ordinary feel sacred. Marcus arrived at the cottage carrying not uncertainty, but a deep, quiet courage, as if the crimson sky itself had called him to this threshold. In the sunroom where candlelight softened the edges of the world, Iris prepared the space with extra care. Fresh water in the bowl, the river stone warm from her palm, the bell whose tone could fall through silence like a prayer finding its answer. "Tell me about the bread that lives in your hands," she invited gently. "Not the one you learned to make, but the one that wants to be born through you." Marcus settled into the chair and began to speak, not of techniques or family traditions, but of the feelings that had been kneaded into generations of dough, the pressure to be perfect, to never waste a grain of flour, to rise to every occasion like yeast that never fails to lift what it touches. As he spoke, Iris could see the inherited crimson streams more clearly than ever before. They moved with the weight of decades, carrying not just his father's expectations, but his grandfather's unspoken sacrifices, his great-grandmother's quiet hunger for recognition that had been transformed into flour and salt, and the patient tending of ovens. These weren't Marcus's wounds but his inheritance, patterns of love and pressure that had been passed down like heirloom recipes, each generation adding their own layer of complexity to the mixture. Under the blood moon's gentle influence, these ancient streams began to move differently, not with the urgency of fresh pain, but with the dignified flow of stories that had been waiting patiently to be acknowledged and understood. When Iris opened her hands in invitation, the crimson currents that rose carried the faint scent of old flower, and the particular weight of dreams that had been deferred so long they had crystallized into duty. "It's not about erasing their dreams," Iris whispered as the inherited streams touched her palms, "but about letting yours find their voice alongside theirs, letting your hands create the bread that only you can make." She guided the transformation with infinite gentleness, watching the dark currents lighten and dissolve, not into nothing but into something like rose-gold starlight, becoming nourishment for whatever wanted to grow in the space they left behind. When the session ended, Marcus looked at his hands with new recognition, seeing not just the echo of his father's movements, but the unique strength and sensitivity that belonged only to him. "I think I can finally bake a loaf that tastes like me," he said, and the words carried the wonder of someone discovering they had been speaking a foreign language all their lives and had just remembered their mother tongue. Their connection, born from shared vulnerability and mutual witnessing, deepened into something tender and natural as breathing. It wasn't marked by dramatic declarations, but by the quiet understanding that passed between them, like light through water. He saw the gentle power in her hands and the courage it took to hold space for others. Pain, while she recognized the artist's heart beneath his flower-dusted exterior, and the bravery required to honor the past while creating something entirely new. In the weeks that followed, Marcus began experimenting with a bread that braided all his influences together, one strand of his father's sturdy recipe, one of his own lavender innovation, and one of something so new it hadn't yet told him its name. He baked these experimental loaves on Sundays and left 2 at the lighthouse door, a quiet offering for Samuel's continued vigil. The community responded with the kind of recognition that doesn't need words. Children drawn by unfamiliar but comforting scents. Older customers pausing to taste something that felt both nostalgic and surprising. Neighbors beginning to understand that tradition could be a foundation rather than a limitation. Most remarkably, Marcus began setting aside a basket each market evening with a small handwritten sign, "Pay with a story if coins feel heavy tonight." People did, and the bakery filled with narratives that rose like steam, gentle, strange, ordinary, sacred. The red streams around those shared stories seemed to soften as they were spoken, and the next morning's dough rose a little easier, as if the air itself had been aerated by the breath of honest connection. Walking home together through streets touched by lantern light and the eternal conversation between wind and wave, Iris and Marcus carried between them the quiet satisfaction of work that honored complexity, healing that had preserved the beauty in inherited love while freeing it to grow in new directions. The blood moon was setting, its crimson light fading to silver, but something had been planted in that gentle darkness that would continue growing in the ordinary light of days to come. The stories that bloomed from Marcus's "Pay with a Story" basket began weaving themselves into something larger than any individual tale, like threads finding their way into an ancient tapestry that had been waiting patiently for the right hands to continue its pattern. Iris noticed how the red streams around people shifted after they shared their narratives at his stall, not disappearing but flowing with less resistance, as if the simple act of being heard had reminded the crimson currents that they were part of a larger river system connecting every heart in ways both visible and mysterious. The idea for the circle emerged naturally during one of those soft conversations that happened between customers, when the market's bustle quieted to murmurs and people lingered longer than necessary over their selections. Mrs. Chen, pausing at Marcus's stall to trade a story about her late husband's terrible singing voice for a loaf of his experimental honey wheat bread, watched steam rise from the warm crust and said thoughtfully, "Sometimes I think we all carry pieces of each other's stories, and maybe that's why sharing them makes the weight feel different. Not lighter exactly, but more evenly distributed, like a burden carried by many hands instead of just 2. Elena overheard this exchange while selecting thread from the neighboring stall. her fingers pausing in their careful examination of silk, the color of twilight. "There's something to that," she said softly, her voice carrying the particular thoughtfulness of someone who had spent years stitching feelings into fabric because speaking them aloud felt too dangerous. "Sometimes I think the stories we don't tell are the ones that grow heaviest, like secrets that ferment in darkness instead of rising in the light." Iris felt the possibility stirring in the air between them, recognizing the particular quality of attention that preceded moments of collective inspiration. She thought of Samuel's teaching about the lighthouse, how its beams swept across the water not to illuminate everything at once, but to offer a steady reference point for ships finding their way through individual storms. Perhaps what their community needed was something similar for the heart's navigation, a regular gathering where people could share the weather in their emotional seas without fear of judgment or unwanted advice. The timing revealed itself as naturally as tides following the moon's gentle pull. The new moon was approaching, that phase when Nana Rose had taught her that the world's hidden work happens most quietly, when the absence of celestial light makes inner illumination more necessary and more possible. "When the sky is darkest," her grandmother murmured one evening while preparing chamomile tea, "that's when the earth asks us to turn inward, to listen to the whispers of what needs tending in the quiet places. Your gift finds its gentlest rhythm then too, not for pulling or clearing, but for simply holding space where transformation can unfold at its own pace." Iris prepared the sunroom with extra care, understanding that this gathering would require a different kind of sacred architecture than her individual sessions. She arranged cushions in a gentle oval on the floor, creating a container that felt both ceremonial and comfortable, like the living room of a very understanding friend. The familiar elements remained: the bowl of salt water, the smooth river stone, the bell whose tone could fall through silence like a prayer finding its answer. But she added a larger candle, whose flame would be visible to everyone, and small plates for sharing food, recognizing that the body's comfort often opens pathways for the heart's honesty. Word traveled through the invisible networks that connect small communities, carried not by formal invitations, but by the same quiet current that had brought people to Marcus's story basket. As dusk settled over the harbor, feet found the cottage path without fuss or fanfare. Mrs. Chen arrived with mooncakes that carried the sweet fragrance of celebrations shared with hands no longer present to receive them. Elena came quietly, settling onto a cushion with the graceful economy of movement that came from years of working with delicate things requiring gentle handling. Marcus brought bread still warm from the oven, its crust crackling softly in the candlelit silence, as if whispering secrets to the gathering air. Samuel entered last, carrying the lighthouse's patient rhythm like a companion, who never needed introduction, his weathered presence adding the weight of deep waters to their small circle. "We're here," Iris began simply, her voice carrying the same gentle authority she brought to individual sessions, "to practice the art of witnessing, not to fix or advise or change each other, but to offer our presence as a gift to whatever wants to be shared." She rang the bell once, its tone expanding through the room like ripples on still water, then settled into her own cushion and waited for the particular quality of silence that invited authentic expression. Elena spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper, as she shared not the story of unspoken love that Iris expected, but something smaller and more immediate. How the act of creating beauty with her hands had become a way of holding feelings too large for words. How each careful stitch was a prayer she didn't know how to speak aloud. As she talked, Iris watched the translucent crimson streams around her, beginning to shimmer with new light. Not dissolving, but transforming into something stronger, more vibrant, like silk catching unexpected sun. The sharing that followed unfolded with the natural rhythm of breathing, Mrs. Chen speaking of conversations she still held with her husband's empty chair, Marcus describing the moment he realized his hands could honor tradition while speaking in their own voice, Samuel offering the story of a night when the lighthouse beam felt too small against the vastness of darkness until he understood that even the smallest light could be a companion to ships finding their way home, rather than trying to eliminate the night entirely. As the evening progressed, something magical occurred in the space between their stories. The individual red streams began connecting, creating a gentle circulation of understanding that moved through the circle like shared breath, each person's pain touching the others without being absorbed by them, creating an emotional ecosystem where sorrow could flow freely without becoming stagnant, where healing happened not through removal, but through recognition of the larger patterns of human experience that held them all. When the candle burned low and the gathering drew to its natural close, they agreed to meet monthly, following the new moon's invitation to darkness that made inner light more visible. Walking home through streets touched by starlight and the eternal conversation between wind and wave, Iris carried the deep satisfaction of work that had grown beyond individual healing into something larger and more sustainable, a living practice of mutual care that honored both the necessity of sorrow and the human capacity to transform isolation into connection, one shared story at a time, under the patient gaze of stars that had been witnessing such gatherings since the first humans learned to sit in circles around fires and speak their hearts into the listening dark. The stories shared in their first circle had planted seeds that continued growing in the quiet spaces between words, and Iris noticed how Elena lingered after each gathering, her translucent crimson streams moving with new restlessness, like silk scarves stirring in a breeze that promised change. The seamstress who had spent years stitching love into anonymous gifts was beginning to understand that her careful invisibility, while born from tenderness, had become a kind of gentle prison that kept her own heart from breathing fully in the light. The invitation came naturally during one of those soft afternoons when the market's bustle had settled into evening murmurs, and Elena stopped by the cottage with a basket of mending, her fingers tracing the violet-embroidered edges of handkerchiefs she had made for others but never dared to sign. "I've been thinking about what you said in the circle," she began quietly, settling into the sunroom where late light pooled like honey on worn floorboards. "About the difference between love that serves and love that hides. I think mine has been doing both, and I can't tell where one ends and the other begins." Iris prepared the space with extra gentleness, understanding that Elena's work would require the delicate touch needed for untangling threads that had been woven together so long they had forgotten their separate colors. The familiar elements waited patiently, the bowl of salt water catching candlelight, the smooth river stone warm from her palm, the bell whose tone could fall through silence like evening's first star, finding its reflection in still water. "Tell me about the love that wants to stay," Iris invited softly, watching the crimson currents around Elena's shoulders shimmer with the particular luminescence of feelings that had been polished smooth by years of careful tending. Elena's voice, when it came, carried the wonder of someone discovering that speaking truth aloud could feel like coming home to herself, rather than stepping into dangerous territory. She spoke of David, Samuel's nephew, whose quiet strength reminded her of lighthouses, steady, necessary, offering guidance without demanding recognition. The red streams around her moved like silk catching moonlight as she described the shirts she tailored for him, each one carrying prayers stitched into seams, each delivery an anonymous offering of care that asked for nothing but the knowledge that her love had found useful expression in the world. "The tenderness can stay," Elena whispered, her hands resting open in her lap like flowers that had learned they were safe to bloom. "The gratitude, the way my patience becomes music when I'm creating something for him, that's not the problem. But the hiding, the belief that I'm only allowed to love if I remain invisible, that part feels like wearing clothes that no longer fit." When Iris opened her palms in gentle invitation, the crimson streams that rose carried the particular weight of self-erasure, fine threads of old stories about worthiness and permission that had been woven so deeply into Elena's sense of herself that removing them required the patience of someone untangling precious silk without breaking what deserved to remain whole. As the threads touched Iris's hands, they began transforming, not dissolving into emptiness but becoming something like rose-gold light that could nourish new growth rather than binding old patterns. The shift revealed itself gradually, like dawn arriving so gently that night forgets to resist its coming. Elena began signing her work with small, elegant initials stitched into corners, where they could be noticed by those who looked with attention. The anonymous gifts continued, but now they carried the quiet confidence of someone who understood that her care was valuable enough to claim, beautiful enough to acknowledge as her own creation. More remarkably, Eleanor's artistic voice began expanding beyond the careful boundaries she had maintained for years. She started teaching embroidery to children at the market, her small stall filling with laughter and the joyful tangle of colorful threads, as young hands learned to transform feeling into visible beauty. She created a series of small patches for Marcus's story basket, tiny symbols stitched with silver thread that people could choose to represent their shared tales, making the invisible work of community healing tangible in ways that honored both individual courage and collective care. When David appeared at the next circle gathering, drawn by the same need for honest connection that had called them all to this practice of mutual witnessing, Eleanor looked directly at him as she spoke about the gifts she had been leaving at his door. "I wanted you to know that someone in the world was thinking of you with kindness," she said simply, her voice carrying the particular courage that comes from finally speaking truth that has been rehearsed in silence for too long. His response carried its own quiet revelation. He had been leaving poetry books at the library, hoping the person with such gentle hands might find them and understand that their anonymous care had been received with profound gratitude. Their connection, when it finally found words, felt less like two separate people discovering each other and more like two artists learning to create something together that neither could have imagined alone. Walking home through streets touched by lantern light and the eternal conversation between wind and wave, Iris carried new understanding about the relationship between love and creativity, between individual healing and community flourishing. Eleanor's courage to claim her voice had created permission for others to examine their own ways of loving without asking for recognition, and the red streams throughout their small town seemed to flow with less resistance, more joy, as if the very air had been aerated by the breath of honest connection shared under patient stars. The courage that bloomed from Elena's claiming of her voice seemed to ripple through their small coastal community, like light reflecting off water, creating a gentleness in the air that made even the most guarded hearts consider the possibility of being truly seen. Iris felt this shift in the red streams around their neighbors. They moved with less resistance now, more willing to flow toward offered kindness, as if the very atmosphere had learned something about the safety that comes from witnessing without judgment. It was into this softer weather that Arlen arrived, carrying crimson currents so dense and dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He appeared at the cottage door on a grey morning when the sea wore silver and the air held that particular stillness that precedes important changes. Arlen stood with the careful posture of someone who had learned not to trust his own capacity for gentleness, his eyes holding the hollow emptiness that comes when pain has consumed so much space. There's barely room left for the person who once lived there. The red streams around him moved like oil on troubled water, thick with a darkness that had crystallized over years into something closer to poison than sorrow. "I heard there was someone who helps hearts remember how to breathe lighter," he said quietly, his voice carrying the particular caution of someone who had been disappointed by promises before. "But I should tell you, what I carry isn't the kind of sadness that wants to be healed. It's the kind that's learned to bite anything that tries to get close." The crimson currents around him pulsed with ancient bitterness, resistant to the gentle invitation that had worked so naturally with others, radiating a coldness that made Iris's hands tremble slightly as she recognized this would require every skill Samuel and Nana Rose had taught her about approaching wounded creatures that had forgotten how to trust. She prepared the sunroom with extra care, lighting 3 candles instead of 1, their combined flame strong enough to hold steady against whatever shadows might emerge. When she touched the river stone to her heart, feeling for her own boundaries, Iris discovered they would need to be more flexible and resilient than ever before. "I can't promise to take away what you've done or what's been done to you," she said gently, understanding that some kinds of healing begin with absolute honesty about what remains impossible. "But I can offer witness to whatever wants to be seen, and sometimes that's enough to help the poison transform into something that doesn't destroy everything it touches." The first session revealed the scope of the challenge. When Arlen settled into the chair and the crimson streams began their reluctant approach toward her open palms, they carried such concentrated darkness that Iris felt her own light flickering like a candle in wind, too strong for its flame. The currents recoiled at her touch, snapping back with a force that left them both breathless. Samuel's voice echoed in her memory. Witness first. Don't carry. She closed her hands gently, rang the bell once to ask the room to breathe with her, and let the tide ebb back into Arlen's chest without shame or failure. Some rivers have run so long through barren lands, they've forgotten the taste of fresh water, Nana Rose observed later, as Iris recounted the encounter with troubled wonder. They've grown accustomed to their own bitterness, and sometimes they even come to believe it's their strength. Such streams need many doorways and no sudden light. They must be approached like wild creatures that have learned to survive by trusting nothing. The work that followed unfolded over weeks with the patience of tides wearing smooth the sharpest stones. Arlen returned not as a supplicant seeking quick relief, but as someone who had finally found another person, willing to sit with the worst parts of his story without turning away in disgust or rushing to offer solutions that would only prove their lack of understanding. Some sessions nothing moved at all. They simply shared presence while the crimson streams tested the boundaries of safety, learning slowly that witness could exist without judgment, that being seen didn't automatically mean being condemned. The community's response taught Iris about collective courage and the delicate balance required to hold space for redemption that might never look like the restoration. Stories people preferred to believe. Some neighbors crossed the street when they saw Arlen walking to his sessions, their own red streams swirling with understandable fear. Others, led by Samuel's steady example and Mrs. Chen's hard-won wisdom about forgiveness, that serves the forgiver more than the forgiven, offered small gestures of acknowledgement, a nod, shared shelter under an umbrella during sudden rain, the kind of ordinary human recognition that can mean everything to someone who has forgotten they still qualify for basic kindness. By winter's end, the poison in Arlen's streams had not disappeared, but it had transformed into something more like medicine, still bitter, still requiring careful handling, but no longer toxic to everything it touched. He began helping Samuel with the lighthouse maintenance, his steady hands perfect for the mechanical work, his intimate knowledge of darkness, making him uniquely qualified to tend light that guided others, away from the rocks that had nearly destroyed him. Walking home through streets touched by the lighthouse's faithful glow, Iris carried new understanding about the difference between healing and witness, between transformation and simply offering sanctuary where the most wounded parts of human experience could rest without being forced to change. Some red streams could flow away completely, but others could only be alchemized into something more bearable, more useful, aligned with the larger work of keeping light steady in a world where darkness was always seeking to reclaim territory. It had once held without challenge, the lessons settled into her awareness like sediment, finding the bottom of a still pond. Her gift was not about erasing the full spectrum of human experience, but about creating conditions where even the darkest currents could find their way toward whatever form of service remained possible, one careful session at a time, under the patient gaze of stars that had been witnessing such slow transformations since the first humans learned that healing was not always about becoming whole again, but sometimes about discovering that broken things could still hold light, the transformation that had settled into Arlen's shoulders like winter snow melting into spring streams seemed to awaken something deeper in their small coastal community, a recognition that individual healing could bloom into collective celebration, when tended with the same patient care Iris had learned to offer single hearts seeking their way home to themselves. The red streams throughout the town moved with new patterns now, flowing not just toward relief, but weaving together into something that felt like shared anticipation, as if the very air had learned to dance with possibility. It was Mrs. Chen who first gave voice to what many had been sensing during their monthly circle, her words emerging like steam from warm tea on a cool evening. "We've learned to witness each other's sorrows in this small room," she said, her hands cupping the familiar warmth of chamomile. "But what if we invited the whole town to practice letting go together? The blood moon is approaching, and it feels like the sky itself is asking for our participation in something larger than individual clearing." Marcus looked up from the experimental loaf he'd been shaping, his flour-dusted fingers pausing in their gentle kneading. "Lanterns," he said quietly, the word carrying the weight of sudden inspiration. "Red paper ones where people could write what they want to release, then let them drift up toward the moon like prayers that don't need answers. just acknowledgement. Elena's needle stilled in its careful embroidery as the image took shape in her imagination, and even Arlen, who had learned to approach hope with careful hands, nodded with the slow approval of someone who understood the difference between healing that erases and healing that honors. Samuel's weathered face softened with recognition. "The lighthouse has always been about community care," he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent tending light through darkness. "Every night, this beacon reaches toward ships that might be lost, but it also reminds the whole harbor that we're connected by the same need for guidance home. A festival could work the same way, individual release serving the collective heart." The preparation unfolded with the organic enthusiasm that marks truly collaborative creation. Eleanor designed delicate lantern frames from thin bamboo, teaching neighbors how to stretch red paper over the skeleton, with hands gentle enough not to tear what would carry such precious cargo. Marcus contributed his baker's precision to mixing rice paste that would hold the seams, while Mrs. Chen offered her shop as headquarters, where tables soon bloomed with brushes and ink. Small bowls for the written, sorrows that would travel skyward on the blood. Moon's patient tide, David gathered. Musicians who understood that this ceremony required sound like breathing rather than performance, a violin that whispered instead of soared, a drum that echoed heartbeats, a flute that called to mind distant shorebirds settling into evening roosts. Arlen, whose intimate knowledge of darkness made him uniquely qualified to tend light, mapped the safest locations for releasing lanterns, where wind currents would carry them out over water rather than into trees, working with Samuel to ensure the lighthouse beam would sweep in harmony with the ascending lights. As the blood moon rose like a gentle benediction over their harbor, the entire waterfront had transformed into something between celebration and ceremony. Lanterns swayed from ropes strung between weathered posts, their red glow creating pools of warm light that made every face look softer, every conversation sound like music drifting on salt air. Steam rose from tea kettles and soup pots, carrying the mingled scents of cardamom and night-blooming jasmine, of fresh bread, and the eternal conversation between wind and wave. Iris moved through the gathering crowd with quiet wonder, watching how the crimson streams around people had transformed for this evening. Instead of individual currents seeking individual relief, she saw something more like aurora borealis, vast, shimmering curtains of collective emotion that connected everyone in patterns of shared experience. Individual pain dissolving into the larger tapestry of human longing for connection and the particular grace that comes from being witnessed without judgment. When the moon reached its fullest crimson glow, Iris rang the familiar bell whose tone could fall through silence like a prayer finding its answer. Hundreds of faces turned toward the sky, where their celestial companion wore its dress of deep red, like an invitation to honesty. "We gather under this patient moon," she began, her voice carrying across the water with surprising strength, "to practice the ancient art of letting go together. Not because what we carry isn't precious, but because sharing the weight makes space for new breath, new beauty, new possibilities we haven't yet imagined." The lanterns rose like a constellation being born, hundreds of red lights drifting upward, carrying the written sorrows and hopes of an entire community. As the lights ascended toward the crimson moon, Iris felt the collective release like a tide turning, the red streams throughout their town flowing with less resistance, more joy, transforming isolation into connection under the vast sky that held them all with the same tenderness she had learned to offer individual hearts. Standing with her chosen family of healers and witnesses, watching their neighbors' lanterns drift like prayers toward the blood moon's gentle glow, Iris understood that her gift had grown beyond individual clearing into something larger and more sustainable, a living practice of community, care that honored both the necessity of sorrow and the human capacity to transform it into shared wisdom. One collective breath at a time. The lanterns had long since disappeared into the star-scattered darkness, but their ascension had left something permanent in the air between neighbors, a quality of recognition that made ordinary encounters feel touched by the sacred intimacy they had shared under the blood moon's patient gaze. In the days that followed, Iris found herself drawn to the morning ritual of sharing warm bread with Marcus on the cottage steps, their knees nearly touching as they caught crumbs with their palms and spoke about everything, and nothing in the way people do when the important things are already understood between them. Their affection lived in practical gestures that honored both tenderness and the delicate complexity of loving someone whose emotional weather you could read like familiar handwriting. Marcus would arrive with loaves still crackling from the oven's heat, while Iris learned to keep honeyed tea warm for him on late market nights when his hands carried the particular fatigue that comes from transforming raw materials into nourishment through patient attention. When he told her stories, she practiced the new discipline of watching his eyes rather than tracking the crimson currents around his shoulders, learning to love the person rather than trying to heal the pain. The first real test of their tender balance arrived quietly, as such challenges often do. A delayed flour shipment left Marcus pacing the bakery with the sharp, bright threads of old scarcity fears gathering around his chest like storm clouds seeking familiar territory. Without thinking, Iris reached toward the crimson streams as she would in any healing session, her hands moving with the automatic kindness that had become second nature. The currents recoiled sharply, and Marcus flinched as if a sudden wind had extinguished a candle he had promised to keep burning. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, recognizing the old impulse to help leaping ahead of the newer wisdom to wait for invitation. "I saw the fear and my hands forgot you're not a client seeking clearing. You're you, and sometimes the weather needs to pass through completely, so you know it belongs to you and not something borrowed or avoided." The apology carried its own teaching, and Marcus exhaled slowly, his eyes finding steadiness in the sea's eternal breathing beyond their window. "I do want your help," he said carefully, his voice carrying the particular courage required for honest navigation of intimate boundaries. "Just not always. Sometimes I need to feel the whole storm, so I remember I can survive it, that my strength isn't dependent on perfect skies." After a pause that tasted like wisdom finding its voice, he added, "Maybe we ask each time, a yes or a not today, like opening and closing the shop door when we're ready for customers." They developed signals that honored the complexity of loving someone while carrying the gift of deep seeing. 2 gentle taps on the table meant please witness without fixing. A hand over the heart indicated openness to clearing if offered. And, when either placed a palm flat on the counter and breathed together, it meant they were simply 2 people sharing the same air, not healer and client, but equals in the democracy of human feeling. The signals worked not because they were magical, but because they reminded both to choose rather than assume, to honor consent as an ongoing conversation rather than a single decision. Their daily intimacy grew around these careful negotiations, creating space for both individual weather and shared shelter. They made sandwiches in the quiet kitchen during Marcus's late returns, thick slices of his experimental bread with fig jam and crumbling cheese, eaten while leaning against counters and inventing small ceremonies with napkins and laughter. The sandwiches tasted like ordinary mercy, teaching Iris that love was less about remarkable moments and more about learning the gentle art of repeating tenderness until it became a way of living. The community noticed their ease with the peripheral, vision that recognizes lighthouse beams without needing to name them. A reassurance that didn't require explanation, but offered comfort through simple presence. Children lined up for Marcus's lavender rolls as if their mornings depended on them, while neighbors began sharing their heart's weather with Iris without expecting miracles, content with the soft medicine of being truly heard by someone who understood that witnessing was often more powerful than fixing. Most remarkably, love began changing Iris's work without altering its essence. The sunroom expanded to accommodate what they started calling kitchen sessions, informal gatherings where people could share emotional burdens while hands worked. Together, preparing food that would nourish both bodies and the particular hunger that comes from feeling isolated in pain. The red streams moved differently in this domestic setting, flowing with the relaxed honesty that comes when healing happens alongside useful work, when transformation unfolds through the ancient rhythms of kneading dough rather than in spaces set apart from ordinary life. Through Marcus's steady presence, Iris discovered that her ability to see in clear crimson currents had grown more precise, more gentle, informed now by intimate knowledge of what it meant to witness someone's full humanity on a daily basis. His baker's understanding of patience and timing deepened her own approach to the delicate work of helping hearts remember how to breathe freely, while his hands that transformed grain into sustenance reminded her that the most profound healing often happened through the simple act of creating something useful and beautiful together. One evening, as they watched the lighthouse sweep its patient beam across darkening water, Marcus voiced a fear that had been stirring quietly in his chest. "Sometimes I worry that if all the inherited burdens flow away, there won't be enough left that feels like me, as if my identity is woven from the weight I carry rather than the hands that choose how to carry it." Iris didn't reach for the gentle crimson threads pulsing around his words. Instead, she took his flower-dusted hand in hers, offering presence rather than clearing. "Your identity isn't in the burdens you inherited," she said softly, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had learned to love complexity rather than seeking simple solutions. "It's in the kindness you choose to offer, the bread you bake with patient attention, the stories you gather like seeds for future gardens. Those are the deeper currents that never truly flow away, but simply change form, becoming nourishment for whatever wants to grow in the space they leave behind." Walking home through streets touched by lantern light and the eternal conversation between wind and wave, they carried between them the quiet satisfaction of work that had evolved from individual healing into something larger and more sustainable, a living practice of love that honored both the necessity of witnessing pain and the human capacity to transform it into shared wisdom. One careful conversation, one patient choice, one gentle boundary at a time, under the faithful gaze of stars that had been watching such tender negotiations since the first humans learned that healing begins not with the removal of all sorrow, but with the courage to love each other exactly as they are, crimson streams and all. The seasons that followed the Blood Moon Festival carried a different quality of light, as if the collective release had cleared something in the very air that allowed recognition to pass more easily between neighbors who had learned to see each other's crimson streams without fear or judgment. Iris found herself drawn into conversations that began with practical questions about tending gardens or mending nets, then deepened naturally into discussions about the weather in people's hearts, the way clouds gathering on emotional horizons could be acknowledged before they became storms that required shelter. It was during one of these organic exchanges that Mrs. Chen voiced what many had been sensing in the gentle spaces between words. "You've taught us to witness our own sorrows in the circle," she said, her hands busy arranging fresh rolls in the bakery display while her eyes held the thoughtful attention of someone working through an important recognition. "But there are others, young ones especially, who carry the same sensitivity you once did, who see the red streams but don't know what to do with such sight except feel overwhelmed by the world's emotional weather." Marcus looked up from the experimental loaf he'd been shaping, flour dusting his dark hair as understanding dawned in his expression. "Teaching," he said simply, the word carrying the weight of sudden clarity. Not just the clearing, but the preparation, how to approach the streams without being swept away, how to offer sanctuary without becoming the storm shelter for everyone else's pain. Elena nodded from her corner table, where moonlight seemed to pool in the fabric spread before her careful hands, her needle pausing as she recognized the truth they were circling. The first students found Iris through the same mysterious current that had once drawn her to Samuel's lighthouse, young people whose moss-colored eyes tracked invisible currents with the focused attention of those learning to read words in an almost remembered language. Nor arrived carrying a notebook filled with sketches of sound waves, her shy intensity marking her as someone who had always felt too much and needed permission to transform overwhelming sensitivity into useful gift. She described hearing emotions as low humming in her chest, a constant symphony that left her exhausted by day's end. Jalen came next, the harbor porter whose silence had always been a kind of shelter for others, his massive forearms and gentle eyes creating a paradox that made people trust him with their heaviest burdens. He possessed the rare gift of saying nothing in ways that invited everything, his presence a harbor where emotional storms could rest without judgment. Then Marta, the school nurse whose hands smelled faintly of peppermint and whose laugh always started in her eyes, arrived seeking guidance for the children who came to her office, not with scraped knees, but with hearts that hurt in ways they couldn't name. Iris prepared the sunroom with extra care for these teaching sessions, understanding that apprentices required different sacred architecture than individual healing work. She arranged cushions in a gentle circle that felt both ceremonial and comfortable, adding elements that honored the complexity of learning to hold others' pain without being consumed by it. The familiar bowl of salt water caught candlelight, the smooth river stone waited to anchor trembling hands, and the bell, whose tone could fall through silence like evening's first star, remained ready to call attention to the present moment. The teaching unfolded with the patient rhythm of tides, each lesson revealing itself through careful repetition of practices, refined through generations of gentle healers. Iris found herself speaking in Nana Rose's voice as she taught Noor to feel for the fence of gentle light around her own heart, to distinguish between the low humming of her body and the emotional music of other hearts seeking harmony. She guided Jalen in transforming his natural silence into conscious witness, showing him how to ask questions that were really doorways. Would you like me to listen? Would it help if we breathed together? Marta learned the delicate art of approaching. Children's crimson streams, which move differently than adult currents, brighter, more changeable, requiring the same patience needed for tending seedlings that might grow into any number of beautiful forms. She discovered she could place her palm 3 inches from a trembling shoulder and invite red threads to soften without ever touching skin, creating safety through proximity rather than contact. As autumn deepened, Samuel's weathered presence began showing signs of the profound completion that comes when life's essential work has been accomplished. He moved through the lighthouse with the careful grace of someone whose bones had become repositories of stories, his steps smaller but more deliberate, his voice softer but carrying greater authority. One windless evening, he called Iris and David to the beacon chamber, where brass and glass caught starlight like promises made visible. "Not all lights are ours to tend forever," he said, placing David's steady hand on the control panel with the gesture of blessing rather than burden. "The beam belongs to the harbor. I was only its steward for a while, teaching it to reach toward ships that might be lost." The red streams around him had grown so deep they were nearly black, but they moved with serenity rather than despair, carrying the weight of grief that had learned to serve rather than simply endure. His passing came as gently as tide returning to familiar shore, a soft exhale in sleep, leaving behind the particular stillness that speaks of work completed rather than interrupted. The community mourned him through practical kindness, Arlen tending the lighthouse mechanisms with hands that understood both darkness and the necessity of steady light, while Elena stitched a narrow band of dark silk around the lantern's base, tiny stars embroidered along the hem so the beacon wore subtle constellation in Samuel's honor. The teaching circle that emerged from these transitions carried forward the essential wisdom while adapting to each generation's particular needs. Iris established rotating roles that distributed responsibility like shared weight, an anchor to keep time and tend candles, a witness to offer eyes that didn't turn away, a keeper of water to transform what was released, a listener to hold first and last words. The positions rotated like tides, ensuring no one became the ocean by accident, while everyone learned the full spectrum of skills needed for sustainable community care. Standing in Nana Rose's herb garden, where morning light fell across plants that still carried the memory of gentle hands, Iris understood that her grandmother's greatest gift had been teaching her to trust the ancient rhythms governing both individual healing and community flourishing. The lineage would continue, she knew, carried forward by hands that had learned to hold both light and shadow with equal gentleness, creating sanctuaries where the world's pain could rest and transform, where healing happened not through removal of all difficulty, but through recognition that no heart suffers alone in the vast, interconnected web of care that holds them all like a lighthouse, holds ships safe in its steady, patient beam. The years had gathered around Iris like gentle rings on an ancient tree, each season holding the memory of hearts touched and transformed, of crimson streams that had learned to flow toward the vast sea of shared human experience. She sat in the cottage garden, where night-blooming jasmine released its sweetest fragrance into air, thick with the anticipation of endings that were really beginnings, watching the apprentices prepare for what would be her final blood moon festival with hands that had learned the patient art of holding space without being consumed by what they witnessed, nor moved through the market with quiet confidence. Her notebook of sound wave sketches transformed into a practice of helping children understand that the humming in their chests could become music rather than overwhelming noise. Jalen's silence had deepened into conscious sanctuary, his massive presence creating harbors where the harbor workers could rest their emotional weather between shifts. Marta had revolutionized the school district's approach to children's feelings, teaching entire classrooms the difference between fixing and witnessing, creating spaces where young hearts could acknowledge their storms without shame. Marcus found Iris among the herbs that still carried Nana Rose's careful attention, his flower-dusted hands offering warm tea that steamed like small prayers in the approaching twilight. Their love had aged into something more precious than early passion, a daily practice of choosing tenderness, of witnessing each other's weather without trying to change the sky. "They're ready," he said softly, settling beside her on the wooden bench where so many important conversations had unfolded. The circle continues without needing your hands to guide it. As the blood moon rose like a patient benediction over their small coastal town, Iris felt the familiar stirring in her chest, not the urgency of work to be done, but the gentle invitation to personal release. The red streams throughout the community moved with their own wisdom now, flowing freely toward the apprentices' offered kindness, settling into deep currents that honored complexity rather than seeking simple solutions. Elena's careful stitches had taught a generation to mend not just fabric, but the small tears in their own understanding, while David tended Samuel's lighthouse with the same reverent attention to guiding others safely home through darkness. The festival unfolded with organic grace, hundreds of red lanterns rising toward the crimson sky, like prayers that didn't need answers, only acknowledgement. Iris watched from the cottage steps as her chosen family gathered, Mrs. Chen, whose grief had aged into wisdom, Arlen, whose darkness had learned to serve the light, Elena and David, whose love had found its voice through patient witness rather than dramatic declaration. They sat in comfortable silence, understanding that her own tide was turning toward whatever ocean waits beyond the lighthouse's beam. For decades, she had offered her presence as sanctuary, where others' sorrow could rest and transform. But tonight she recognized her own need for the gift she had spent a lifetime giving. The crimson streams that rose from her chest carried not the weight of unprocessed pain, but the accumulated wisdom of thousands of sessions, the particular exhaustion that comes from being a lighthouse for so many years that you forget you too need guidance home through the dark waters of your own heart. Without speaking, Marcus took her hands in his, offering presence rather than clearing, witnessing rather than trying to heal. As her own red threads flowed toward the patient moon, they transformed not into emptiness, but into something like rose-gold starlight, becoming nourishment for whatever wanted to grow in the space they left behind. She felt herself settling into the profound completion that comes when life's essential work has been accomplished, when individual gifts have bloomed into community, flourishing that will continue, long after the original gardener has returned to the earth that taught her everything about patience and growth. The deepest revelation came not as dramatic insight but as gentle recognition. Her gift had never truly been about the individual currents of pain she had learned to clear, but about helping people understand that their crimson rivers were always meant to flow toward the sea of shared human experience. The red streams had been teachers, showing her that healing happened not through the removal of all difficulty, but through recognition that love was the gravity holding them all in its patient, luminous embrace. On the morning when her own tide turned toward the vast darkness that makes all light visible, Iris released her final crimson streams into the starlight, with the same gentle intention she had brought to thousands of clearings. She understood at last that her greatest teaching had been showing others that the world's pain was not a burden to be carried alone, but a river system connecting every heart to the larger flow of compassion that moves through all things like breath, like tide, like the eternal conversation between wind and wave. And somewhere, in the cottage where jasmine still blooms and the lighthouse still sweeps its patient beam across dark water, the work continues. Gentle hands learning to approach crimson streams with reverence, young voices discovering they can offer sanctuary without being consumed, hearts opening to the ancient understanding that healing is not about perfection, but about connection. Not about removing all sorrow, but about transforming isolation into the recognition that no one suffers alone in the vast, interconnected web of care that holds them all like stars held by the patient darkness that makes their light visible. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.